Good afternoon, everybody. I will attempt to stay by the microphone and keep my voice up, but every once in a while I'm bound to turn to the screen and you might lose my voice. If that happens, just shout and remind me to keep facing forward. So yes, I was here back in 2019 telling you about the images taken by the Apollo astronauts on the surface of the moon, asking, is this genuine or have these images been faked? The great moon hoax. Today, for the next 2 or 3 hours, I'll be telling you about a different set of images, because I've always had an interest in my research about images and imaging, whether it be microscopes or telescopes. But in this particular case, I started getting interested in the idea that lots of people have taken images of things in the sky that they didn't quite know what they were. Some people claim that these UFOs, these unidentified flying objects, might have an extraterrestrial origin. Maybe these are spacecraft from visitors from another world. And I started to ask myself, well, if you look at the images, is there any evidence for any images of UFOs being extraterrestrial? So bear in mind, I am not talking about alien abduction stories. I'm not talking about people's reports of seeing things. I'm purely looking at, let's have a look at a whole load of images and ask ourselves, is there a simple explanation for the images we're looking at, or are we left with the conclusion it must be extraterrestrial aliens? So that's what I'll be doing this afternoon. So you can start by saying statistics don't lie. So something that got me interested was a survey carried out a long time ago, well, quite a few years ago, asking a group of individuals, and I'm not sure who the individuals were, but some people were asked, have extraterrestrial aliens visited the Earth? Now, I'm fairly sure the group of people asked were American. I'm not sure if it was youngsters or oldsters. It might have been university students. But they were asked, have extraterrestrials visited the Earth? And a staggering 40% said, yes, probably, as far as we can tell, yeah. Then if you ask the question, well, do you think aliens are walking amongst us as we speak? Are aliens from another world on this planet now? And you'd think that would be a much lower number. Well, it's lower, but it's still 35%. I'd love to know what these numbers were for Britain, but I can only find data from the US at the moment. I need to do a bit more digging. 35% is fairly staggering. It's less than the number of people who believe in ghosts, but it's greater than the number of people who believe in telekinesis, and it's greater than the number of people who believe Bigfoot exists. And the most worrying statistic of all is the number of people who believe that extraterrestrial aliens walk amongst us today is greater in America than the number who believe in evolution. And that is staggering and very worrying. And I'd love to know what the stats are for Europe or Great Britain. But somebody made this point a little while ago. 20 or 30 years ago, nobody walked around with a camera, and therefore if you see something odd, the chances are you can't record it. You can write it down, I saw something weird in the sky, but you wouldn't record it. But for the last, 10, 15, 20 years, everybody has got a camera in their pocket, pretty much. The number of people who walk around with a camera, at the moment, of course, in their mobile phone, has gone from almost 0 to almost 100% over years. So you might argue, if everybody carries cameras with them all the time, surely the idea that there's something inexplicable, whether it be the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot or ghosts or all these other things, surely that should have been settled by now. But it's clear it hasn't been settled, because for a little while ago I simply Googled UFO to find how many web pages I could find talking about UFOs and their interpretation. I found approximately 250 million web pages. So, regardless of what their interpretation is, there's still a huge amount of interest in what UFOs are. So that implies that the issue is not settled, so we have to think about it. I would argue that if you look at images that purport to be unidentified, they fall into a number of categories. In other words, some of them can be identified with a bit of thought. Some of them are actually man-made objects, that are misidentified. Some of them are natural objects. Some of them are not actually out there in the sense that you take an image and it might be an artifact of the way you took the photograph or the image. Nothing to do with what was actually out there in the world. And of course, it's always possible that people have faked images, regardless of whether we're talking about the old days of film or the modern digital images, they can be faked. And the elephant in the room is, although those four might account for a lot of images, there's always the outside possibility that there is a fifth explanation for UFOs, and that is that they are the spacecraft of extraterrestrial visitors. So I would argue that all UFOs fall into one of those five categories, which we're going to look at. So firstly, just a few definitions to get out of the way. UFOs, some people say, instead of talking about unidentified flying objects, the modern word is unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP, or unidentified anomalous phenomena. That just means people are trying to get rid of the connotations of UFOs, but I'm going to stick to UFOs in this particular talk. And regarding whether or not UFOs have an extraterrestrial origin, I side quite definitely with Carl Sagan, who said quite a while ago, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you are going to make a claim that this thing here that you can see or imaged in the sky is an extraterrestrial spacecraft, if it's such an extraordinary claim, you really need rock-solid evidence to make that claim. Otherwise, it's much more likely to be a simpler explanation. And another useful tool for the rational scientist, which is something that most scientists adhere to, is Occam's razor, which in full would say something like this, if you excuse me reading it: if there are two explanations for an observation, the one that requires the least speculation is usually better. And most people paraphrase that to say, if there's two ways of explaining a particular piece of evidence, the simpler one is probably the better one. If you're not looking for complex answers, if you're looking for a simple answer, the simple answer is probably right. You can't guarantee that, but it's much more likely to be right. So where do you find reliable information about UFOs? Well, given that you do find some in the UK, but there's an awful lot of UFO sightings in America, one good way of getting UFO information is to go to a UFO information kiosk like that. Notice the little green man sitting on the porch there. So there are a number of these dotted around various states in the USA. Whether they are there just to sell trinkets or not, it's difficult to tell. But what, of course, we would like, given that there are so many cameras out there, if these flying saucers are indeed extraterrestrial spacecraft, we would really love to see lots of nice, clear images, well exposed, well focused, no camera shake with the camera going all over the place. It would be nice if we had some images like that, and then we could say, yeah, that is pretty good evidence that that is actually an extraterrestrial spacecraft visiting the Earth. But that's not what most UFOs look like. Most UFOs look like that. A smudge, a little bit of light. Not only can you not tell what they are, they're out of focus, overexposed, the camera has moved, the whole thing is blurred, and, rather critically, we often have no information whatsoever about the provenance of the photograph. So I don't know what that is. I can't tell if that's a bright light in the sky, I can't tell if that's a street light, I can't tell if it's Venus, because I don't know who took the picture. I don't know which camera they used. I don't know what time of day they took the picture. I don't know where they were in the world when they took the picture. There's no information attached to that photograph that tells me anything about who took it and when and where and with what equipment. Therefore, it's essentially impossible to try and work out what that blurry splodge actually is. And you could argue that 90% of UFO images fall into that category of there is absolutely no way of telling because we simply do not know the origin of the photograph. With modern digital photographs, it's easier because they are date stamped, you know where they were when they were taken, you know when it was taken, etc. So it's a little easier to track recent digital images than it is old images. So even blowing it up doesn't help, you can see. You take a splodge, you blow it up, you get a splodge twice as big. It doesn't help you work out what it actually is. So let's have a look at a few possibilities. Some UFOs quite definitely are man-made objects. So for instance, this particular picture, I put in the caption there, is this perhaps a long exposure image of a whole fleet of UFOs flying through the sky? Well, military aircraft don't fly that far apart. Commercial aircraft don't fly in formation. So would anybody hazard a guess as to what particular phenomena we are looking at here? Any guesses? Nope. Meteors will generally appear to radiate from a point. They don't seem to go in what appears to be almost parallel lines. No, not in this particular case. They generally don't fly in formation at night. Most air displays aren't at night. Yeah, I like the idea that. But here, I've deliberately tried to mislead you by asking the question, is this a long exposure of something flying through the air? It isn't actually a long exposure. It's a snapshot. It's just a snapshot. It's not lots of lights moving through the sky. It's a picture of lots of lines in the sky. What are those lines? Well, sorry? Hey, we have a winner. As soon as we realize it came from pylonofthemonth.org, you realize, yes, it's real. It's actually an electricity pylon with a whole load of cables that have been iced up. And because they're icy, they're reflecting light that is just over the horizon. So I've put the pylon in there so you can now see that this is a whole load of cables going to a pylon. It's a really misty night, so you can't actually see the pylon. So that's the original picture. And yes, I did actually get it from pylonofthemonth.org. For those of you who haven't explored the wonders of electricity pylons all over the UK, wonderful webpage, go look at it. I think it still exists. And everything else in the foreground is just obviously a tree or a few branches or something else. So I put this one in to make the point that if you think it's a snapshot, you come to a different conclusion than if you think it's a long exposure in which lots of objects are moving into the distance. So you've got to be careful regarding what it is you're actually looking at. And of course, if anybody sees one of these things, you don't tend to see them in the UK, but if there's a rocket launch in the United States, that rocket launch might leave a trail in the sky, especially if the rocket launch was around sunset. The sun can still illuminate the rocket trail, and you can get some really weird and wonderful effects. And when you get this sort of jellyfish in the sky, not surprisingly, lots of people ring up their local areas saying, I've seen a UFO in the sky. But if you track it to the most recent rocket launch, it all makes perfect sense. And yes, you can get some wonderful structures of rocket exhaust left in the sky, giving all sorts of weird, wonderful colors and shapes. The rocket trail might be relatively straight to start with, but if you wait for a few minutes or a few hours, the wind in the atmosphere can distort the contrail, the rocket exhaust, and produce a really distorted looking trail and some beautiful colors as well. So you can get rather odd results. And again, if anybody looked into the sky and saw a whole load of blue blotches in the sky, the idea that, well, we must be looking at an alien invasion, well, maybe, but if you realize that actually, I can't remember if this was NASA or a different space agency, we're basically sending up sounding rockets, releasing fluorescent dye into the atmosphere, into the high atmosphere, to see how that dye starts to spread out, to get an idea of what's going on in the upper atmosphere. It helps us understand phenomena like aurora, which we had the other week, for instance. So if you didn't know that was happening, you might be fooled into thinking this is really weird. But once you realize it's just a scientific experiment, you realize there's a simple explanation. And of course, 20 or 30 years ago, if we had seen a whole load of dots in the sky dancing around, we might have thought, this is really weird, this is obviously extraterrestrial. But in the last few years, we've got used to the idea that if you put up a whole load of drones, you can make any pattern you like in the sky, from the coronation a couple of years ago. So again, something that was really weird a few decades ago is now, as it were, commonplace, and we can now recognize these things because we've seen them more than once. Some people will say, well, it's obvious that we've been visited because you can see where the spacecraft landed. I flew over this particular state, whatever it was, and I looked down out of my aircraft window and I saw these really weird features. Clearly, they are landing pads for the UFOs. That's where they came down in the desert, whether it be, I don't know, Arizona or Utah or somewhere else. But it actually doesn't take an awful lot of research to realize, well, if you flew from A to B and you saw this at a particular time, all you have to do is to calculate over which particular part of America you were at, and then you use Google Earth to say, well, what actually is at that particular location? And you find it's a solar power plant with lots of mirrors on the ground, each of which reflects a little bit of sunlight in a particular way. All the mirrors are at different angles, and so it gives a rather weird-looking reflection, especially if you're a few miles up in an aircraft. So perfectly explicable once you realize what it was you were looking at. And I intended this talk to be mainly about images, but along the way I got sidetracked onto looking at videos. And there are, unfortunately, a huge number of videos of people saying, look, I've seen a UFO. A classic one from many years ago was this one, where somebody was incapable of keeping the camera still. They were obviously getting very excited, and they were saying, look, there's a cigar-shaped UFO hovering over the lake, over there, a couple of miles away. It's not making any noise, and it's not an aircraft, so clearly it's extraterrestrial. That got posted on YouTube, and that got millions of people looking at it, even though within hours of it going onto YouTube, the people in that particular cigar said, yep, that's us. We were flying the Goodyear blimp over a football stadium. That's definitely us. There's nothing extraterrestrial. We were just photographing from on high the American football game. But even though the explanation came out almost immediately, that didn't stop millions of people looking at the videos saying, wow, look at that UFO hovering over the lake. Sensational stuff gets more adverts, gets more clicks, gets more viewers than simple explanations. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is. So when I saw another link saying, what was it, super clear footage, somebody has got super clear footage of a UFO, I thought, well, that might be worth looking at. If the video is super clear, let's have a look at that and see how good this video is. That was the super clear footage. Anybody know what that was? Anybody get a glimpse of it? Okay, the photographer, the videoer, settled down after a few minutes and tried to get a slightly better image of it. And he or she did get a slightly better set of footage. And eventually, if I just freeze this at the end of this short clip, you can actually see what it is. Yep. Jonathan or James or Jennifer or Jenny, somebody had a birthday party and a large mylar balloon escaped and floated up and caught the sunlight. So it's obviously a big J. If it's far enough away and it glints in the sunlight, it can look rather odd. But if you just get a decent image of it, it's pretty clear what it is. But whilst I was looking at videos, again, I wasn't intending to do this, but I came across a statement, again, excuse me if I actually read it out, where one of these videos said, look at this video. It's from Puerto Rico, which is a hotbed for UFOs, apparently. And although there have been countless UFO sightings, many experts, I don't know who these experts are, but many experts consider this next video footage the gold standard of UFOs. This is the 100% proof, irrefutably, that this is a UFO. And I thought, I don't want to spend the rest of my life watching YouTube videos of UFOs, but if they consider this is the best one, well, I owe it to them to at least look at this one and see what it is that they claim is irrefutable. So I thought, right, let's take this gold standard video and see what it is. To the credit of the people who took the video, it was taken by the US Customs Border Patrol. So US are always flying over the border, especially the America-Mexico border as well as Puerto Rico. They are looking for immigrants and they are looking for contraband. And they have plenty of technology. They have aircraft and they have really good infrared cameras on those aircraft looking down, looking for people, looking for contraband. So I figured that this is as close to state-of-the-art as a video can get. So I thought this is worth looking at. So I watched this particular video, which lasted for a few minutes. Here's a minute or so of it. And it shows this object close to the center. I hope you can all see it okay, close to the little white crosshair. There's a black dot. That black dot appears to be moving helter leather across the landscape. Behind it, you can see fields and cows and cars and buildings. And they reckon this thing appeared to be moving at breakneck speed. This thing is moving much faster than any bird can fly, and it doesn't seem to have wings, and it doesn't seem to be flapping. And we'll see the direction it's moving in just a second, but we can see behind it there's fields, there's buildings. Eventually we pass a field of cows if we haven't already done that. It looks like that's an airfield, it's just crossed a runway. So this particular object is flying over fields and flying over an airport. That's what UFOs tend to do, by the way. They tend to buzz over US airfields or airports. And eventually this carried on, flew over an industrial estate, and then apparently flew out to sea. That's just crossing a road there. There's, I'm not sure that's just an open field. That's the end of the video. It actually went on for another minute, but it just gets a little bit boring. So I thought, okay, this is a reasonably good quality video. It's infrared, it's a black dot. What can we say about this particular object? Well, what I found interesting was A, it's not just a 5-second clip. It's quite a long clip, so you can see what it's doing. I hate this idea of people just showing you a 5-second clip which looks interesting, but then the rest of the clip explains what it actually is. But what I found interesting was because this was a high-tech aircraft with a really high-tech infrared camera, we've got in the bottom left-hand corner, you probably can't read it, it's the GPS location of the aircraft. The aircraft knows exactly where it is to within a meter or so, much like the sat-nav in your car. So frame by frame of the video, we know exactly where the aircraft is. But even more useful is in the bottom right-hand corner. That's where the camera is looking. That is the so-called target. That is the GPS coordinates of where the camera is looking. The plane knows where it is. The plane knows which way it's pointing. The plane knows if it's banking or not. And the plane knows where the camera is. So you can work out what's the point on the ground where the camera is looking. So effectively, we know where the camera is, and we know where the camera is looking. There are not that many videos where you have that amount of really useful information. So I went through the video frame by frame and picked out those coordinates of where the camera is and where the camera is looking. We noticed just 1 or 2 frames before I look at the actual GPS locations themselves. Here, the object is in the middle. And you can see in the circle there, there's a few objects in the background. I think they are cows. They might be sheep, but in Puerto Rico, I think it's more likely to be cows. So the object, bear in mind this is an infrared camera, and black means hot in this particular case. This object, whatever it is about the same temperature as a cow. And apparently, it's a little bit smaller than a cow. So we can't be definitive, but whatever this UFO is, it's smaller than a cow, and it's warm. And if we follow it a little further, we see behind the object there are cars on the road. Each car is a little sort of rectangle with a black blob at one end because the engine is warm. So again, this object is smaller than a car, probably smaller than a car engine, and about the same temperature as a car engine. It is warm. So let's actually take those GPS coordinates and see what we can learn about this UFO. The GPS coordinates, not surprisingly, turned out to be Puerto Rico because that's where the aircraft was flying. There's the scale bar. We see that this particular map is a few kilometers in size. I'm just going to dim it down because I'm not particularly interested in what's in the background. It's more the object itself. And if we plot, not every frame, but every few frames, we plot what are the GPS positions of the UFO. That's what the UFO did. And the UFO, or the ufologists, the people who say this is an extraterrestrial spacecraft, will say, look, this craft seems to be moving in a curve and is heading sort of eastwards and then northwards, but look at which way the wind is blowing that day according to the weather. The wind is blowing from the northeast. So this UFO is going into the wind. This can't be an object that's getting blown by the wind. This is an object which is moving against the wind with no signs of any propulsion, no wings, no engines, and yet it's moving against the wind. That's proof that this is a weird object. So I said, okay, that's what the UFO appears to be doing, bearing in mind that this is where the camera is pointing. I said, well, where's the aircraft during this time? And the aircraft was doing this at the time. The aircraft was flying from effectively top right to bottom left. And it's really useful because frame by frame you can say, where's the aircraft, where was it looking? Where's the aircraft, where was it looking? Where's the aircraft, where was it looking? So if you draw a line from where the aircraft is to where it thinks the UFO is, I've just taken the third spot, the UFO must be somewhere on that grey line because that's where the camera is and that's where it's looking, so the object is somewhere along that line. Do that for various frames of the video. What do you find? Let's do it again. Let's do it again. Let's do it again. Let's do it again. So what do you notice about all those lines of sight? They all cross at one particular point. So either you say the UFO is going hell for leather from bottom left to top right, or you say, no, it's static. It's just where that black dot is. And the only reason it seems to be going hell for leather that way is because the aircraft is going hell for leather that way. And of course, if you're looking at a static object, then the background, it will appear to move against the background just because the camera is moving. So as far as I can tell, this video is entirely consistent with an object just sitting there doing nothing, not traveling at incredible speed into the wind, but just sitting there. I actually took that video a little bit longer and traced it for an extra few minutes and came to the conclusion that if you wait long enough, after a few minutes, the place that you seem to be looking at, the black dot, seems to have moved ever so slightly towards the left, ever so slightly towards the west. Remember which way the wind's blowing? Okay, so this thing appears to have drifted very slowly downwind. It is not going hell for leather upwind. It is simply misinterpreting what you're looking at because you're not taking into account the camera was moving. With all of this data, anybody can look at this video and say, I can instantly see what's happening. But the people that want to believe that this is an extraterrestrial origin will not take that evidence. They'll just say, wow, look at that thing go when you look at the video. So the YouTube blurb said, what we've got here is a metallic orb, they say, moving at incredible speed, they say, with no obvious propulsion, they say, into an 18-mile-an-hour headwind. And they conclude by saying the camera sees an object that does not match anything we know of. In other words, the statement is, if you look at this video, there is no technology that can explain that particular object and the way it appears to be moving. There's no way you can say it's a metallic orb. There's no way you can come to that conclusion from the video. The video just tells you there's something small and relatively warm. There's no way you can tell it's a metal. There's no way you can tell it's spherical. It's just a blob. Moving at incredible speed? No, I would argue the video does not show that the object is moving at incredible speed. It has no obvious propulsion. Well, I would agree with that. It doesn't have any engines on the side of it. It doesn't appear to have any wings making it fly. So I agree that it doesn't have any obvious means of propulsion. And it's moving into an 18-mile-an-hour headwind? No, it isn't. It's sort of, if anything, drifting ever so slightly downwind. So the statement, there's nothing we know of that can explain this, is clearly rubbish, because it only takes a few minutes to actually explain it. So Occam's razor says one explanation is on the left. It's an extraterrestrial spacecraft moving at incredible speed. But Occam's razor says, is there a simpler explanation? Well, I believe a simpler explanation is the object that they imaged is effectively static. It's sitting there at some particular height above the ground, but appears to be hardly moving at all. It's drifting slowly downwind over a period of many minutes. It's not moving at incredible speed. It's moving at a few miles an hour. I think it's another balloon. It's a small object, heated by the sun, so it's fairly warm, smaller than a cow, and it's just sitting there, drifting with the breeze. So you could argue that that one I ticked, there's no obvious means of propulsion. Well, there's no internal means of propulsion, yes, but the means of propulsion is it's just in the breeze. And so, yes, the breeze is actually making it move. So I would argue that tick needs to be across anyway. So that's how Occam's razor works. You either have a very convoluted, very detailed explanation, or you have a very simple explanation. Neither is proof But if you've got a simple explanation and a really complicated one, the simple one is probably right. So, given that time is getting on, let's have a look at other possibilities. UFOs can be natural objects, not necessarily man-made objects. So as well as Pylon of the Month, I've also been scouting through the Cloud Appreciation Society Cloud of the Month. And yes, there are lots of these, not surprisingly, there's one new one every month. And there's lots of interesting looking clouds. Some look a little bit like a disk or a flying saucer. Some look really weird, like this one on the bottom right. It looks like something has punched a big circular hole in the cloud, as if a big flying saucer has come down, punched a hole in the cloud, and then landed. Well, maybe, but there are meteorological reasons. If you go and study the weather, there are reasons why these various clouds form, including the one that looks like a hole punch has been taken to a particular ring of clouds. And occasionally you see weird clouds like this, so-called lenticular clouds, especially on tops of mountains. Here's a lenticular cloud sitting on top of Mount Fuji. Even though it's a wonderful image in its own right, that doesn't stop people taking an image like that, saying, that's not going to get many hits on YouTube or on my Instagram page. I'm going to just modify it slightly. I'll edit it to make it look a little more interesting. So they take that image and they modify it slightly. And then it gets far more clicks and more revenue through the adverts, etc. But there are interesting natural phenomena that can easily be misinterpreted. If you see this, you think, what are all those searchlights doing over there, pointing vertically up into the sky? You go closer to them, you don't find any searchlights. So what is going on? Is this an indication of UFOs landed, or are they trying to signal to each other? No, it's just a natural phenomena. We don't tend to see it very often in the UK. You need very cold temperatures for ice crystals to form, and when ice crystals form in the atmosphere, they often form in little hexagonal platelets which sit horizontally, which act like a mirror reflecting streetlights a little bit further away. And if you've never seen them before, they can look quite weird, a bit like seeing, the northern lights. If you haven't seen them before, it can look rather spectacular. And sometimes you see different colors simply because you are looking at reflections of street lights of different colors, or possibly domestic lights or industrial lights of different colors. And depending on where this ice forms, that determines where you see these so-called light pillars. In some cases, these light pillars can appear to be very high in the sky, and in effect, you're looking at a reflection of a whole load of lights that might be even over your horizon. So you get this really weird state of you seem to be seeing a city in the sky, as it were. So I've never seen this for myself, but it looks like this sort of image would be quite spectacular if you ever saw it for yourself. But if you live in frozen latitudes, maybe you see these things all the time, so maybe they're not that unusual. What is quite unusual are these things. They're called red sprites. We're all used to the idea that if you see a thunderstorm, then it's not unusual to find a lightning bolt under the thunderstorm discharging the electrical charge from the cloud to the ground, or the ground to the cloud. What we didn't realize happened until fairly recently is if you were to look above a thunderstorm with the right sort of imaging equipment, you sometimes get what you might think of as being lightning upside down, lightning coming up from the top of the cloud into space, not from the bottom of the cloud down to the ground. So these red sprites are relatively faint and difficult to see, but can be caught with a camera. And this one was a few years ago, and I saw an even more detailed image from 2023? Yes, it was only last year that this image was taken. And again, you'd be forgiven for looking at this thinking, that looks really alien, in the sense that we've never seen anything like this before. And so, yes, we do need to do research on what it is. What is the phenomena that produces these sorts of structures? Weird upside-down lightning, and why does the lightning sort of end up with these little fuzzy blobs on the top? Yes, we don't understand all the details, but no one is claiming that this sort of sight is extraterrestrial, even though it's really weird because we haven't seen it so often. This one I particularly like, given my hobby in astronomy. Somebody, again in America, said that in the caption to the image, which I'm about to show you, the caption read, well, it was near the end of the day, it was in the evening, I was sitting on my deck looking west, something caught my eye. In the west, at sunset, a really bright object in the sky. In truth, I can't be sure what it is. My conclusion, a UFO. There's a knee-jerk reaction. If you don't know what it is, you call it a UFO, and then UFO individuals jump on top of it. This is something that is quite common whenever you see a light in the sky, is it is very tempting to try and say how big is it. But in this particular case, this individual said, my friend thinks the object is as big as 2 airliners. If you don't know how far away an object is, how can you possibly say how big you think it is? Obviously, a small object close to can appear to be the same size as a really big object a long way away. So if you don't actually know how far away the object is, then you can't actually estimate its size. But it's still very common for people to do that by squinting and saying, it looks like, well, I've seen aircraft in the sky, and this seems to be about the same size as an aircraft. In this case, my friend says it's the size of 2 aircraft. I thought 1, but maybe he's right. So in other words, there's a little disagreement there as to how big this object is, but they're both wrong because what they were looking at was Venus. And Venus is a lot bigger and a lot further away. This guy got his zoom lens on his camera and eventually steadied it down so that this huge zoom eventually showed that this was indeed, as reported in the newspaper, an arc-shaped UFO. Arc-shaped meaning it's a crescent. Okay, Venus does show a crescent phase just like the moon. It's just a lot smaller, and you tend to need binoculars or a telescope to see the crescent, but in this case, the zoom lens of the camera was enough. And any astronomer who sees a bright light in the west after sunset knows that it's a pretty good chance you're looking at Venus. It's a lot brighter than a lot of people realize, the Venus in the evening sky. It's in the morning skies every once in a while as well, but not everybody is up at that time of day. Let's have a look at one other category, image artifacts. When anybody says, I took a picture and I now have a picture which seems to show a UFO in it, I don't remember that UFO being there at the time, what they're effectively saying is, it wasn't there, but it's showing up in the photo. That screams at you that it's an artifact. It's something about the way the picture was taken and nothing to do with what actually was out there. This goes back a long way. It's nothing to do with digital cameras. It works with old cameras as well. Back in 1952, a picture of a whole swarm of some things seemed to be buzzing around the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. So some people said this is a UFO invasion, but if you look carefully and look at what's at the bottom of the image, what's at the bottom of the image? A whole load of lights. What happens if you take those lights and turn them upside down and just move them to the top so we can see them better? Every light has an exact copy in those little fireflies that seem to be buzzing around the Capitol building. In other words, we're not looking at objects behind the building, we're just looking at reflections of the lights. Those lights are shining into the camera. They're much brighter than everything else. You sometimes forget that when you shine a bright light into a camera, you're going to get reflections, and those reflections are going to cause sort of ghost images, if you like, which are nothing to do with what was actually there, purely a reflection inside the lens of the camera. Sometimes the reflections are very distorted, so this particular image appeared somewhere, and the comment was, well, I saw this large craft that came close to the photographer, so close you can see windows in the image. Well, I'm not convinced I can see windows in this particular UFO, but you can tell this is for real because this is a UFO sighting that is 100% proof that aliens exist. A, it's 100%, so that means it's really good, but also notice that aliens is in capitals, so that really does reinforce that this is really good proof. But that's only a crop of the image. When you look at the whole image, you realize the photographer has actually photographed a really bright moon shining straight into the camera lens. If you have a really bright object shining into the camera lens, you're bound to get a reflection. In this case, the reflection is very distorted, and you end up with that horrible green mess on the left-hand side. Nothing to do with UFO spacecraft. More recently, a posting I found on the internet where somebody was saying, what's this in the sky? We've got a picture of a lantern, but there's something in the top left there, which I don't remember seeing that when I took the picture. Is it a UFO? And just to show that this individual was genuinely trying to figure out what was going on, they added the hashtag UFO and followed that by a hashtag serious question. In other words, I do really want to know what this is. So if we blow that up a little bit, that little odd-looking object that appears to be in the background, if we blow it up, we can ask ourselves, what is it? But remember, what are we looking at? We're looking at a picture where the sun is shining directly into the camera. The sun is just peeking out behind that wall next to the bracket that's holding the lamp. So the sun is a disk. Part of it is peeking out behind the wall, so we would expect to see a disk partially cut off by the wall. What do we see in this reflection? We see a disk partially cut off by the wall. It's the opposite way round. Remember, it's upside down because most reflections end up upside down when you're reflecting light inside a camera lens. So we're seeing a circle partly cut off by the wall. What's this other stuff that's blocking out the circle? Well, remember, the sun is shining through a bracket of the lamp. There's some filigree work on the ironwork there. So we're seeing basically just the shape of the filigree work on the bracket of that lamp. It's just the sun upside down, somewhat fainter because reflections tend to be fainter than the original. That is exactly what you would expect to see when you have a bright light shining into a camera lens. This is one of my favorites. I don't have what I need as a prop to hand, but you can see what's going on. Here's an image, and somebody is saying, look, there's a huge slab-shaped spacecraft in the sky up there. I can see it, and it seems to be bright around the edge. What appears to be a flat, rectangular aircraft with lights all the way around the outside, hovering in the sky with no obvious means of propulsion. UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists have claimed it's an advanced type of spycraft known as a TR-3B. Notice once you give it a name or a number, it starts to get some sort of reality behind it. It's not just a UFO, it's a TR-3B UFO. Looking at that image, I am fairly sure that's taken from a car, an automobile of some kind. There seem to be raindrops on the windscreen, and you can see headlights illuminating those raindrops. So I'm fairly sure we're looking through the windscreen of a car. If we're looking through the windscreen of a car, is it likely that we're seeing a large slab-shaped UFO in the sky? Or is it more likely we're looking at a reflection of an iPhone sitting on the dashboard? That looks to me exactly the size and shape and rounded corners and a little metal trim around the edge of an old iPhone of a few years ago. They change designs every once in a while, excuse me. But to me, that looks like exactly what you would expect if you had an iPhone sitting on the dashboard and you took a picture through the windscreen. So Occam's razor says, well, it's one or the other, which is more likely. Okay, time moves on. I've got a few more minutes. So let's look at one of the categories of, well, maybe they're not there at all and it's purely fake. Now, okay, I think we would all agree that if you have to point at the object that you think is a UFO, it's probably a faked image. And I don't think anybody would ever claim that that is a real image of a UFO coming out of a cloud bank. If that actually did happen, think how many people would have seen it, because that's over what appears to be an interstate of a big city. If a UFO like that did appear, millions of people would all have a photograph of the same object. And that, as far as I know, has never happened. But we can look back over old images and try and work out whether they are genuine or whether they are fake. And that's sort of how I got started in this whole business, because I like analyzing images. And this appears to be an image of 3 flying saucers flying over a particular town in 1966, was it? Yes, 1966. But if we look in detail at the object itself, the UFO, and we look in detail at something that appears to be in the foreground, I think that's a tram line post or something. If we look in detail, we see that although they are at essentially the same distance, perhaps the UFO is a little bit further away, but if the tram line is in focus, that's virtually infinity as far as the camera lens is concerned. The UFO should be equally focused. And yet, when we look in detail at the tram lines, the wires themselves seem to be totally sharp, implying that this was correctly focused at infinity on the tram lines, on the tram wires. And yet the UFO in the distance is blurred. Not because it's moving, because that would blur in one direction but not the other. This is simply somebody taking a flying saucer type image, blurring it and slapping it cut and paste on top of an image of some clouds. So that looks wrong because the focus is wrong. And for a similar reason, you can take other images where it doesn't appear to be focused correctly. Here's one I pulled off YouTube, and you're struggling to see what on earth that is. So I took this particular one and simply processed it to show a little more clearly the triangular shaped UFO that they were actually trying to show. In this case, it's not more blurred than you would expect. In this case, the triangular UFO is way too sharp. If you look at the amount of noise, the amount of mottling in the background, that's what you would expect from if you were blowing up a small amount of a digital image, blowing it up a lot. You'd expect to get some noise in the background, some mottling, and yet the edges of the triangular UFO are razor sharp, and there's no way you would get that unless it's an artifact that somebody has just placed into that image. So that, again, is a fake. A couple of UFOs buzzing Air Force One. No, I looked at that in detail. The contrast is wrong. The contrast you would expect from the UFOs is similar to the contrast you would expect for Air Force One if they are at a similar distance. The contrast isn't perfect because they are some distance away, and the atmosphere between you and Air Force One will reduce the contrast, but it looks wrong because the contrast isn't what you would expect for two objects at that distance. I rather like this one, thinking, well, that's obviously a fake, but can I actually prove it? It looks like this is a picture of an aircraft carrier deck in which somebody might have placed a triangular UFO, as well as a helicopter and an FA-18 jet. So the helicopter and the jet, I think, are genuine, but I don't think the UFO is. But I wondered, can I actually prove that? So I actually went in and looked at the individual pixel values close to where the jet is. I think that's genuine. I looked at the deck, the flight deck, just next to the F-18 aircraft, and I looked at the variation of one pixel to the next. And again, for a perfectly normal, natural variation, you'd expect to get some noise, you'd expect to get some variation. Even if you're looking at a relatively uniform gray flight deck, not every square inch, not every square centimeter of the deck is going to be the same brightness. So you would expect to get some variation, and that's what we're seeing. Pixel by pixel, we're seeing a small variation. That, to me, looks perfectly natural. I did the same next to the triangular UFO. What do we see? Perfectly natural variation, and then it goes absolutely dead straight. Pixel by pixel by pixel are exactly the same brightness, and then it goes back to normal again. Somebody quite definitely has doctored this image and hasn't been very good at changing the pixels to make the pixels look natural. They've just blurred it and smoothed it, and that cannot happen by natural means. That is quite definitely somebody doctored the image. And this one, again, claims to be something buzzed my aircraft when I was flying from A to B. That particular object, that little craft you can see in the sort of right-hand side, I blew it up just to see what it looked like and realized that it bore a striking resemblance to a particular object which appears in a certain video game which I can't mention for legal reasons. So in other words, they just took on the internet a particular 3D model, if you like, of a particular thing out of a game, and then just slapped it into this video to try and make it look like a UFO. So unfortunately, it is getting easier and easier and easier to fake images, and that's going to get simply easier and easier. It was difficult 20 years ago, but it's so easy now. So we always have to be on the lookout for people deliberately faking images. But my time is almost up, so I better finish with what is the elephant in the room. Is it possible that we are actually looking at objects that are the result of extraterrestrial visitors? Now, there are lots of UFOs in the world, and some people, for our convenience, have documented them all. So we might think that UFOs are just splodges in the sky, but no, there are 80 different types of UFO. They're all different shapes, flying saucers. But I noticed actually this set of 80, it's actually set number 1. So somewhere out there is another set number 2 of another 80 types of UFO. So some people definitely believe there are large numbers of these out there. To try and put this to rest, NASA had a review of UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. They spent a few £1 million and they looked at various bits of evidence to see what was going on, to see if any of them have extraterrestrial origin. Remember what I said at the beginning of this talk? I said, Carl Sagan, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I also said that the big problem with UFOs is that quite often an image doesn't come with any provenance. It doesn't come with who took it, when, etc., which camera. After spending a few £1 million, NASA came to the conclusion, having spent a year and a half on this, they came to the following conclusions. Their conclusions were extraordinary claims requires extraordinary evidence. They also came to the conclusion that most UFO images don't come with enough data to be useful. They also came to the conclusion there was no conclusive evidence of extraterrestrial origin. If NASA had come to me 5 years ago, they could have saved $10 million because I would have told them precisely that. But now you have it officially from the horse's mouth that there are lots of interesting images out there, but none of them show extraterrestrial origin. So let me finish with the point. If there's a lack of evidence for UFOs, what does that mean? Well, we know the Milky Way galaxy in which we live has got 300 billion stars in it. And interestingly enough, most of those stars seem to have planetary systems going around them. A little while ago, we weren't sure how many stars had planets. Now it looks like pretty much every star has a set of planets. So that means if we say half of them have got planets, that means there's 150 billion planetary systems out there in our galaxy. And we didn't know until recently that a lot of those planets are Earth-like. Again, 20 years ago, we didn't have a clue. Now we've got a pretty good idea that every solar system is likely, or at least reasonably likely, to contain an Earth-like planet. So let's divide by 3. Let's assume a third of them have got Earth-like planets. That means there are 50 billion Earth-like planets in our galaxy. It's very difficult to work out anything about life. Some people believe that as soon as the conditions are right, life is inevitable. Some people say life is unlikely. We don't know. But let's just assume that 99% of the time, life does not arise from an Earth-like planet. That means we would only have life originated on something like 500 million of those worlds. How likely is it that that life becomes complex life? We have no idea. Let's assume that 99% of the time it doesn't. So it's only 1% of those where complex life evolves. Now we're down to 5 million. What's the likelihood of intelligent life? We don't know. Let's assume that 99% of the time, complex life does not develop intelligence. So let's divide by 100 again. We're now down to 50,000. There are 50,000 Earth-like planets out there where life might have arisen. So if alien life is out there, where are they? Why have we not had any contact? Why do we not have any evidence of contact, regardless of what you may believe is likely? I don't know if you remember this picture from 1994. When the Voyager spacecraft left the solar system, they looked back at Earth, and Earth was just a single pixel in the image. And Carl Sagan had this quote about the pale blue dot. Look at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, every human being who ever was lived out their lives on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. That's the Earth. All life we know is based on this planet. We have no evidence of life elsewhere. But I find not the idea of being visited by extraterrestrials. I don't find that unsettling. What I find unsettling is the thought that we might be alone. Thank you.